as I'm sure you know because you've had a chance to read the essay, it's a pretty difficult one. Adorno and Horkheimer are major philosophers of the modern period, and they're drawing on a much longer philosophical tradition in making their argument. So one of my goals for the lecture today is to give you a sense of the background out of which they come and a sense of why their account of the culture industry, or what we might call American mass culture, is so negative and even borders on paranoia. So to get us started, I just want to review some quick background information. Um, the culture industry enlightenment as mass deception was first published in German in 1944, and then it was republished with a new title, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, again in German in 1947. This was an extremely famous collection of essays. It's good to remember that we're reading it in English translation, and that we're also reading an abridged version. The original version was about 20 pages longer than this one. This one, being much shorter, is going to be much easier to teach to your students, but it's still something to keep in mind. So Adorno and Horkheimer come out of a school that was created in Germany in the town of Frankfurt, and together, Horkheimer and Adorno and their fellow intellectuals came up with a mode of thinking that they called critical theory. At the time, the major social schemes that different countries were experimenting with were capitalism, revolutionary socialism, or communism, and fascism. The Frankfurt School group actually disagreed with the premises of all of these social and economic templates for a society. And they thought all of them had shortcomings and were trying to draw on Western philosophical traditions to find a new way forward, a new path for humanity that would offer people an alternative to all three of these isms, capitalism, communism, and fascism. One of the things that is really important to understand with the culture industry as an essay is that it was shaped after Adorno and Horkheimer were forced out of Nazi Germany. Both men were German Jews, both were forced to flee for their lives, and both left Germany in the early 30s. Horkheimer ended up being able to reconstitute the Frankfurt School at Columbia University, which has a very interesting history of its own. And then by the late 30s and early 40s, he had relocated in Los Angeles and arranged for Adorno to join him there. In Los Angeles, they had a really good view of the Hollywood film industry in particular, and they were horrified. They ended up thinking that Hollywood and U.S. mass culture in general had the power to lead the U.S. in a fascist direction. So it's important to remember in the 30s, when Adorno was working on some of the ideas that show up in the culture industry, the U.S. hadn't entered World War II yet, and there were anti-Semitic and fascist movements going on in the United States. So even though today it may seem like their view of mass culture as the product of an authoritarian society seems a little paranoid, at the time there were genuine reasons to worry about the status of the U.S. as an authoritarian society that only called itself free. And that's actually something that's really interesting to discuss with students, particularly in the current era. So to understand the essay, it's really important to have some understanding of the philosophical background out of which Adorno and Horkheimer come. When you are reading the actual text of the essay, they're using words and concepts in a way that assume that you have some understanding of Hegel, Marx, and Kant behind you. So in a really simple, cut and dried way, I'm going to give you some background on that philosophical tradition. And with Sean's help, I've tried to color code some of the main ideas so that you can see how they weave in and out of the discussion that will follow in the next couple of slides. You may have noticed in reading the culture industry that Adorno and Horkheimer use the terms particular and general a lot. And this goes back to their reading of Hegel. So in yellow, Sean and I have put the idea of the particular and the general, and we're going to tie that to a summary of Hegel. Adorno and Horkheimer also rely on the concept of the autonomy of art, which is theorized by Kant, Immanuel Kant, and they add to that the idea of the thinking individual. So that set of ideas we're marking in red. And in addition, then they develop an idea about the power of negation. The power of negation is a concept that replaces the revolutionary power of the working class in Marx's theory of history. So just try to hold on to these three ideas as we move through the next slides. What I'm going to try to do is go back and show you how each of them comes out of Hegel, Marx, or Kant. So as some of you probably already know, Hegel developed a theory of history, which Marx later revised. In Hegel's theory, the human spirit is struggling against a state of necessity and contingency, trying to seek a state of freedom through self-knowledge or self-realization. In the entire history of the world, one nation after another will emerge in the leading or the strongest position. Through the development of that nation's national culture, each individual citizen in that nation can advance his or her own quest for freedom and self-realization by partaking of a general national culture that lifts them away from their day-to-day necessities and helps realize their potential for creative activity and creative self-realization. Each nation that attains that leading position eventually falls and is defeated by or gives way to a new nation that takes up that human task and brings it to the next level. At each moment in time, the leading nation says that it has realized the most perfect form of culture humanly possible at that time. But in the end, when we move to the final redemptive end of history, we will arrive at a time when that perfect culture is perfectly realized and it's shared across the globe. Every single individual in the globe will be able to share in a culture that lifts that individual into a state of freedom and self-realization. Along the way, until we get to that moment, there are going to be particular individuals who are not partaking of that general culture, either because they are locked into lives of labor, or because they're ignorant, or because they belong to a nation that hasn't achieved that cultural sophistication. But in the final days of history, everyone will be able to experience and participate in that culture. So what Marx does is he comes along and says this business about spirit is just nonsense. The struggle for human freedom is not spiritual in nature, it's material in nature. And what people all over the globe are doing are struggling to create, through their labor, a culture in which everyone, especially everyone who works, is able to share in the fruits of their work freely and fully. Adorno felt that Marx's theory put forward a very salient critique of capitalism, but he and Horkheimer did not think that the working class was in a position to carry forward the revolution anymore. In fact, one of their main ideas was that the culture industry itself created a false paradise that made workers content with the status quo. So instead, they create this idea of the thinking individual who, in interacting with the realm of culture and art, is going to be able to maintain that hope for a future time of universal freedom and self-realization. The problem for them is that the culture industry puts the existence of the thinking individual into doubt. So we'll just go through one more summary of a philosopher, and then I'll tie this directly to the essay that Adorno and Horkheimer write. So Kant is a major theorist of the aesthetic, and one of the premises of his theory is that the realm of art is autonomous. It's cut off and separate from the realm of everyday life. Unlike the world of everyday life, which is driven by a desire for profits and is governed by self-interest, the realm of art is autonomous, aesthetic judgment is disinterested, and the contemplation of true art or of great art lifts people away from their everyday realm of concerns. It lifts them away from the pursuit of profit and from the pursuit of self-interest. So that means that for Adorno and Horkheimer, the realm of art provides a place from which to critique this capitalist status quo. But the reason why I'm talking about great art or true art is for Adorno and Horkheimer, as well as for Kant, not all art is truly art. There are some artistic or cultural forms that purport to be art, but are actually created in order to make profits for somebody and in order to sell the sufficiency or the satisfactoriness of a profit-driven status quo. So what Adorno and Horkheimer argue is that in distinction from false art or false culture, great art can measure the gap between our current capitalist society and the ideal society of universal freedom through universal self-realization that Hegel talked about. The gap between our current society and the ideal society that art measures is negative in nature. One of the ways we become aware of that gap is through suffering. So Adorno and Horkheimer argue that suffering is a negative truth on page 7 of the essay you received. By linking a record or a representation of our suffering with a sense of the beautiful, great art can keep the dream of a better society alive. One of the ways great art does this is to fuse a record of our suffering with a stylistic rendering of our reality. And through that reliance on style, it tries to point the way to a more beautiful world. But by measuring the gap between the world that we live in now that is full of suffering and the world that we're striving to attain, great art can show us that the society that we have right now is not all there is. It's not enough. One of the things I want to start doing with you then is looking at particular passages in the essay. When I teach this essay to students, I try to give them some background information that will help them understand particular passages. And then I go to these passages that I think are key statements of the argument, and I try to work them through with the students. So in this passage on page 8, Adorno and Horkheimer are arguing that great art spurs the thinking individual to question the status quo, because great art strives to reconcile its message of suffering with the ruling style of its day. But the better the artist and the more important the art, the less well it conforms to the requirements of that style. So that part is a little counterintuitive. So they write, only in this confrontation with tradition, of which style is the record, can art express suffering. That factor in a work of art which enables it to transcend reality certainly cannot be detached from style, but it does not consist of the harmony actually realized, of any doubtful unity of form and content within and without, of individual and society. It is to be found in those features in which discrepancy appears, in the necessary failure of the passionate striving for identity. Instead of exposing itself to this failure in which the style of the great work of art has always achieved self-negation, the inferior work has always relied on its similarities with others, on a surrogate identity. So in this passage, you see Adorno and Horkheimer making a distinction between great art, which ironically fails. It fails to show that the individual's experience coincides with the idealized experience of society in general. Lower art or mass cultural art will show that the individual and the idealized society in which he or she lives already coincide. Mass cultural art or false art will make that identity falsely. But great art or true art shows that there's still a gap between our lived experience of suffering and that stylized reality that purports to be the ideal reality that we all want to have. So now I'm going to try to move from a particular passage to the broader outlines of the essay. Go back and show you some passages that I think will be much easier to understand. Some of the passages are really, really opaque and you need a lot of background knowledge. Other passages read pretty well right as they are, and they're really good passages in which to try to engage the students in your classroom. But to go for a minute to the broader argument of the essay. In miniature, the argument says that the culture industry destroys the individual by destroying the autonomous status of art. The culture industry equates art, which is supposed to be created without profit in mind, with business, in which everything is created solely in order to make a profit. When art loses its autonomy, the thinking individual becomes completely subject to the governing ideology of a profit-driven society. The products of the culture industry offer us a false satisfaction by convincing us that we're getting the best there is. Through American mass culture, we get to participate in the best and the only culture that is available for all of us, everyone in the society. And the society itself declares that this is the best culture there is, the best culture possible. So when we accept the satisfactions that are marketed to us through the culture industry, we lose the opportunity provided by great art to feel the discrepancy between our current society and the ideal society of universal freedom and universal self-realization. So in other words, great art succeeds because it fails to create a false identity between the particular work of art and the general or ruling style of its time. When that identity does not exist as a real possibility for all particular individuals and the general culture of freedom and self-realization in which they are said to take part. When the thinking individual contemplates great art, he or she can discover the gap between the ideal society that we all want to achieve and our present society, which calls itself the best there is, but which continues to make people suffer. So I actually say in some of these PowerPoints, Adorno, a lot of Adorno's own thinking forms the backbone of the culture industry. Through his notes and through his essays in the 30s, a lot of the ideas that end up in the culture industry can be attributed to Adorno. But in fact, Adorno and Horkheimer both write this essay, so I should really be saying Adorno and Horkheimer. So Adorno and Horkheimer argue that the culture industry threatens to destroy the quest for universal freedom by accomplishing, and this is right in the beginning of your essay on the right-hand side of page 1, the culture industry accomplishes the false identity of the general and the particular. In more detail, mass cultural products are formulaic. Each particular item conforms to the general formulas for making a profit, and that general formula generates them all. At the same time, and this is a really important part of their argument, the individuals who consume these products conform to one another and to the whole society through the act of consumption. I think that this is a place to begin to get your students' attention, because I think that your students will be familiar with this latter idea. This is a place where the theorists are saying something that we already know. When we consume mass cultural products, or even anything else that's part of our everyday life, our clothes, the food we eat, the music we listen to, the shampoo we use, the movies we watch, the way in which we interact with those consumer products becomes key to how we identify ourselves as individuals. Consumption becomes key or core to our ability to express ourselves as individuals. But in fact, the act of consumption isn't making us individuals, it's making us just like everyone else. How many people listen to that song? How many people identify with the heroine in that movie? How many people show that they're cool, free, and cutting edge by wearing Gap clothes or Abercrombie and Fitch? So I think that your students will already understand this point very well. So then they go on to say that two lines that come from a part of the essay that was excerpted, but I think that they're very helpful in summing up Adorno and Horkheimer's arguments. So I'm going to review them with you here. They argue that the liberation which amusement promises is freedom from thought and freedom from negation. The enemy who is already defeated, the thinking individual, is the enemy thought. So what they're saying here is that the consumer industry offers us false satisfaction and also false individuality through the products that it markets to us. And by becoming content with the status quo, by becoming secure in the knowledge that we really are individuals when we buy and consume these mass cultural products, we cease to hold on to a critical role in society. We give up the power of the thinking individual to see the gap, that negative space between the society that we live in and the society that would truly fulfill us. So this then is the core of Adorno and Horkheimer's argument. They're afraid that mass culture, American mass culture or the culture industry stops us from thinking, from criticizing society, and seduces us or tempts us into giving up the one thing left that would allow us to work past fascism, communism, or capitalism, all of which are oppressive societies, towards a society that would be genuinely free. So there are a couple of kinks in this argument that I want to review with you. At one point, they argue that marked differentiations between products depend not so much on subject matter as on classifying, organizing, and labeling consumers. Something is provided for all so that none may escape. If you go back to that passage in context, they're talking about things like A grade versus B grade movies, high budget versus low budget movies. But with your students, you could also talk about this in terms of products that are marketed to distinct genders, to distinct ages. So products like films marketed towards women versus films marketed towards men, or products marketed towards tweens, TV shows marketed towards tweens as opposed to children or adults. What they're getting at here is that products that are marketed to us as individuals, you're a woman, you get this kind of film, you're a man, you get this kind of film, are typing us. They're clustering us and organizing us into distinct consumer groups in which we learn our type. And our type gives us a place in an unequal society. But we move into that place voluntarily. Oh, I'm a girl, so I like this kind of movie. Oh, I'm a girl, so I like this kind of perfume. Oh, I'm a girl, so I like this kind of music. Or, oh, I'm a working class guy, so I like action films. I don't like those pseudo-intellectual French thrillers. And in this way, each of us just sort of voluntarily moves into a type, a consumer group, a slot that we voluntarily accept as being, the product of our free choice in a ranked and divided and hierarchical society. The other point that they're making is that there's something for all of us, because all of us can find something in American mass culture that pleases us. None of us feel the dissatisfaction or the experience of being left out that might make us think more critically about the society in which we're operating. So I'm going to, here on this PowerPoint, show you a passage that you can find in the essay, and then a particularly good passage that was excerpted, that did not appear in the abridged version you have. Again, you need to remember here that Adorno and Horkheimer are German Jews who had to escape with their lives from Nazi Germany. And so you can see a kind of horrific fear of a false complacency, a false joy of a society that is gathering to dance at someone's expense. All are free to dance and enjoy themselves just as they have always been free since the historical neutralization of religion to join any of the innumerable sects. But freedom to choose an ideology, since ideology always reflects economic coercion, everywhere proves to be freedom to choose what is always the same. So they conjure up this image of festivity, of this huge group party. Through mass consumer culture, we all get the chance to enjoy ourselves, as long as we never question the piper's tune that is making us dance, as long as we never ask, whose music is this that we're dancing to? Who pays the price for this music? We can keep dancing. And going back again to that dialectical relationship between the particular and the general, society and the individual that is so important to Hegel, they argue that the false identity of society and the individual signifies fascism. So what they're saying here is that even though capitalistic America calls itself a free society and gives every member of the democratic society the freedom to choose, that society that declares itself free is really an authoritarian society, even a fascist society, that is making everyone accept the only choices that are available to us and cutting off access to a critical sensibility that would encourage us to question what's missing in this society, who pays the price in this society, what happens to the people who have no jobs and can't participate in mass culture except as onlookers, what happens to the people whose wages are so low or so insecure that they're going to remain at the bottom of society their whole lives. Adorno and Horkheimer argue that the culture industry keeps us from asking questions like that. Another way to put this, and this you can draw on quotes from the essay that you're going to read with your students, the culture industry manufactures our needs for us so that it can satisfy them. So this is not just Adorno and Horkheimer's idea. This is actually a very common idea that goes back to Marx. And the idea is that instead of marketing products to needs that human beings actually have, businesses in a capitalist society market products that create needs for us. So a really easy example would be cigarette. Who needs a tobacco addiction? But once you buy that product and start using it, you have a need for it. But it's not just addiction they're talking about. They're talking about this whole huge, gigantic pile of products, images, movies, soundtracks, clothes, furniture, games, bicycles, dogs, anything you can think of. That because it's marketed to us, suddenly we have a need for it. And this is how Adorno and Horkheimer talk about that in their essay. They say certain reproduction processes are necessary that inevitably require identical needs in innumerable places to be satisfied with identical goods. At that point, they're ventriloquizing what businessmen say. They say, we have to make all of our products the same because everyone all over the country has the same need. And instead they say, no, consumers don't start with identical needs. Those needs are made retroactively. We need that product after we buy it. Those needs are predetermined needs. The business people determine that we're going to have that need. We don't determine that ourselves. Or the other thing they call it is manufactured need. Capitalism doesn't just manufacture products, it manufactures the needs that go along with that product. So again, this is basically a Marxist idea, but it comes into Adorno and Horkheimer's argument. So to sum that up, you can say consumers buy cultural products that fill a need they didn't know they had until they bought the product. Identical products create identical needs rather than the other way around. So here I'm repeating a point. I've tried to make this point a couple of times. This has to do with the power of negation. The culture industry squashes an awareness of discontent. So Adorno and Horkheimer, the need which might resist central control has already been suppressed by the control of individual consciousness. What is decisive today is the necessity inherent in the system not to leave the customer alone, not for a moment to allow him any suspicion that resistance is possible. The principle dictates that he should be shown all his needs as capable of fulfillment, but that those needs should be so predetermined that he feels himself to be the eternal consumer, the object of the culture industry. Not only does it make him believe that the deception it practices is satisfaction, but it goes further and implies that, whatever the state of affairs, he must put up with what is offered. So I don't know about you guys, but a passage like this makes a fair amount of sense to me, partly because it puts forward ideas with which a lot of us are already familiar. I think your challenge as teachers in the classroom will be to show the students some understanding of the passages that are very obscure and hard to follow because they fall so heavily on a philosophical background. For those of you who want to make sure that the students understand the whole essay, I've provided this philosophical background, and particularly with ambitious students or students who are going to do some work outside of the classroom, that philosophical background is there for you to try to explain some concepts if the students get into asking questions about that. But I think that some passages like this and a couple other ones I'll show you, you could circle and talk about with students just through a close reading in class. It would be interesting to get students to talk about their experience of a system that never leaves the customer alone. It would be interesting to talk about whether the culture industry or American culture parades products that satisfy needs that are capable of fulfillment, or whether your students think, well, you know, does mass culture help me identify needs that can't be fulfilled? Does mass culture turn your students into eternal consumers? Does it give them a kind of satisfaction that feels deceptive to them? Does mass culture force young consumers, like your students, to put up with what is offered? Or do you have students who go, well, hell no, you know, I look at mass culture and what it offers me, and it actually makes me want to go and do stuff in my own basement, or, you know, put together a garage band or something. Mass culture sparks my creativity. It doesn't kill it. So again, I think going over a passage like this would be an interesting place to get students to think about the essay, but also maybe argue with the essay. Sean also shared with me the Frontline Generation episode that I thought was really interesting, and I was able to tie it to 2 points that come to the end, at the end of the version of the essay you were given. And these places are actually, I think, also places that are pretty easy to understand and are really good places to settle down with students and try to perform a group close reading. So in one of the points they write on page 5 of your essay, the whole world is made to pass through the filter of the culture industry. The old experience of the moviegoer who sees the world outside as an extension of the film he has just left, because the latter is intent upon reproducing the world of everyday perceptions, is now the producer's guideline. The more intensely and flawlessly his techniques duplicate empirical objects, the easier it is today for the illusion to prevail that the outside world is a straightforward continuation of that presented on the screen. Sorry for my typo. So what they're saying here is that instead of the screen, movies, TV, videos on the internet, imitating reality, it feels more and more to the consumer like reality is imitating the screen. Reality is becoming an extension of the visuals, the visualized narrations that mass culture is producing for us. And when I talk with my students in college about this, a lot of them instantly recognize this idea. Sometimes people talk about Disneyland, but to be honest, my students participate in so many of the newer forms of online culture that they have even better examples than sort of my old-fashioned example of Disneyland. So in a much longer passage, but is also one really good to talk about with students, they write, real life is becoming indistinguishable from the movies. This is itself a sentence that students can think about and argue about at length. They go on and say the sound film, far surpassing the theater of illusion, leaves no room for imagination or reflection on the part of the audience, who is unable to respond within the structure of the film, yet deviate from its precise detail without losing the thread of the story. Hence, the film forces its victims. So again, these guys escaped Nazi Germany. This really pumped up paranoid rhetoric has to do with the moment that they live in. Hence, the film forces its victims to equate it directly with reality. The stunting of the mass media consumers' powers of imagination and spontaneity does not have to be traced back to any psychological mechanisms. He must ascribe the loss of those attributes to the objective nature of the products themselves, especially to the most characteristic of them, the sound film. They are so designed that quickness, powers of observation, and experience are undeniably needed to apprehend them at all. Yet sustained thought is out of the question if the spectator is not to miss the relentless rush of facts. I'm going to go back to that in a moment, but all of this stuff is actually really debatable, and it would be interesting to debate this with your students. What they're trying to say is that the way the film is actually technologically made forces us to use some parts of our brain and to shut down others. It forces us to be constantly trying to catch up with a relentless rush of facts, to simply catch and organize everything the way a worker on an assembly line would have to always be meeting that wrench with that, hubcap coming down the line. There's a constant busyness as we notate and collect and aggregate the facts of a film. But what the film does not allow us to do is ever leave that mode of engagement for a more musing, daydreaming, creative, and spontaneous one in which we use our imagination or our ability to dream. Even though the effort required for his response is semi-automatic, like the worker's action on an assembly line, no scope is left for the imagination. Those who are so absorbed by the world of the movie, by its images, gestures, and words, that they are unable to supply what really makes it a world, do not have to dwell on particular points of its mechanics during a screening. All the other films and products of the entertainment industry which they have seen have taught them what to expect. They react automatically. And this is a great quote to discuss and argue back and forth with students. The might of industrial society is lodged in men's minds. So again, that goes back to this idea that we're living in an authoritarian society that calls itself free. We live in a society that tells us we're exercising free choice when we consume mass cultural products. But the logic, the governing ideology of our society is lodged in our minds. And instead of engaging art critically and exercising our powers as thinking, imagining, dreaming individuals, we engage it automatically. We accept its products as what there is, the best there is, and all there is. So I know that Sean is asking you to teach this essay in a unit called about work or about labor, and that's an interesting choice because most of the argument is about actually leisure or entertainment, culture. But towards the end of the essay, Adorno and Horkheimer make a key argument. Amusement under late capitalism is the prolongation of work. It is sought after as an escape from the mechanized work process and to recruit strength to be able to cope with it again. So the mechanized work process would be like the factory line, but it would also be like the bureaucratic infrastructure of an office. But at the same time, mechanization has such power over a man's leisure and happiness, and so profoundly determines the manufacture of amusement goods, that his experiences are inevitably after images of the work process itself. So what they're saying here is that when you go to the movie, you are experiencing the same habits of mind and the same need to keep up with a rushing, relentless process, that leisure feels like work. The ostensible content is merely a faded background. What sinks in is the automatic succession of standardized operations. What happens at work, in the factory, or the office can only be escaped from by approximation to it in one's leisure time. So I was really fascinated, and I'm really sorry not to have the chance right now to dialogue with you about the Frontline show, Generation Life. I think that Sean and you are going to talk about it in the next session. But some of the interviews with teenagers that were foregrounded in that Frontline show offer a kind of weird, horrible literalization of this passage, where the young woman that was so interested, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but the young woman that was interested in the show that was asking her to spread their newest campaign, ad campaign, actually said to the interview, what I'm doing as a fan feels like work. So then in the last point they make, and this is again something that you see in the Frontline Generation Like show, they argue that under the regime of the culture industry, we're not individuals anymore. We end up becoming, psychically on our insides as well as physically on our outsides, advertisements for the culture industry. So they write, the assembly line character of the culture industry, the synthetic planned method of turning out its products, is very suited to advertising. The important individual points, by becoming detachable, interchangeable, and even technically alienated from any connected meaning, lend themselves to ends external to the work. And this is interesting. I think your students would be able to relate to this. Today, every monster close-up of a star in a movie is an advertisement for her name. In every hit song, a plug for its tune. Advertising in the culture industry merged technically as well as economically. In both cases, the same thing can be seen in innumerable places, and the mechanical repetition of the same culture product has come to be the same as that of a propaganda slogan. In both cases, the insistent demand for effectiveness makes technology into psychotechnology, into a procedure for manipulating men. And then in the last passage that comes right near the end of the essay, I actually didn't switch the page numbers, but it comes at the very end of your essay. They talk about teenagers, basically, young women and young men who are internalizing the gestures and the performance styles that they see in the movies or that they see in advertisements, so that they begin to act in their own personal lives, in their flirting or their courtship with one another, or the way they present themselves to friends of their own sex. They begin to act out the performance styles and the commodified modes of self-presentation that they see in mass culture. And so they conclude, the most intimate reactions of human beings have been so thoroughly reified that the idea of anything specific to themselves now persists only as an utterly abstract notion. Personality scarcely signifies anything more than shining white teeth and freedom from body odor and emotions. The triumph of advertising in the culture industry is that consumers feel compelled to buy and use its products, even though they see through them. So Sean has made this PowerPoint available to you, and I really encourage you to use it any way you can, either in rereading the essay and trying to work out an understanding of its different passages, or you should feel free to use some of the passages that I've identified here to do close readings with your students. At the very end of the essay, I've tried to summarize some of the ways in which critics have received the essay over the decades. When it was first made, a lot of people embraced it and really believed that Adorno and Horkheimer were making a very important and valid critique. Over the years, though, more and more people have begun to argue with it. So I think I may have run out of time, but in this slide and in the next, I've put down some of the arguments that people have made against the culture industry essay. And that's another reason why I've urged you to look at passages with your students with an eye to debating them. I first was assigned this essay in graduate school, and to be honest, I didn't get a lot out of it. It was very hard to wrap my head around the whole argument. I think that you will do a great service to your students if you can get them to look at and understand some particular passages and particular points. And if you can give them the idea of the thinking individual, someone who engages mass culture critically and asks questions about the role that it plays in that consumer's life, is a key point of the essay. If you can get your students to engage the essay as a way of thinking about and questioning the role of mass culture in their lives, you're going to be giving them access to the argument that is most important and important. Well, one of the things that you can do is, well, let me say a couple things. I think that it's worthwhile to give them a summary of the essay before you assign it. So even if you just give them an idea about the thinking individual and the ways in which Adorno and Horkheimer are afraid that mass culture shuts down our ability to think critically about it. That can become the source of a free write assignment, either at home or in the classroom. Like, do they agree or disagree with that thesis? One of the things that I particularly like and that students also like are a kind of epigrammatic quality to some of the sentences. So I've done some of that here, but it might be an interesting exercise to do with students. I'm trying to go back to the later points of the PowerPoint where their sentences like something is provided for all so that none may escape, or the sentence about the power of industrial society being launched in men's minds, or real life is becoming indistinguishable from the movies. One exercise that you could do would be to pick out some of these lines that are sort of catchy and epigrammatic and ask students to think about them, or to pick examples from their daily life which might support that. And another thing that you could do is to ask them to just look at themselves and what they're wearing or carrying on their person when they're either reading the essay or when they come to the classroom. So I imagine that students today might have an iPod. They're probably going to have brand names on their clothes. They're probably going to have cultural material as well as just plain old everyday products that are branded with symbolic meaning. And you could ask them to do readings of their own self-presentation in terms of mass culture and a broader consumer society. Okay, that's a great question. So Shauna and I were talking about using this essay a lot in advance, and I'm trying to give you guys preparation for two different kinds of students. One is the student, as I think I mentioned earlier, who's really going to try to understand everything about this and is going to try to look up things online and ask you all of these questions. And so I felt like I needed to give you guys a sense of your own way around the essay. So if someone says to you, what's this mean? You would have at least some clue of where to go. But in truth, very few students are like that. And in a given semester, you might not have any students like that. So what I try to tell my students is that the essay is really impenetrable. I want them to learn how to read something that they don't completely understand. I try to give them a summary in advance so that they at least know that there is a point or an argument for them to find. And then what I try to do, particularly with this essay, I try to mark out, I might even give them in the assignment itself, a copy of the essay that had marked passages that would represent places which I think that they can understand. So again, unfortunately, in this essay, most of those come towards the end of the essay. And in my PowerPoint, I put a lot of passages towards the end of my PowerPoint because they come at the end of the essay, which I think people actually could understand. I don't know whether you guys would feel comfortable doing this, but with my students, I say to really understand this essay, you're going to have to read it more than once. You're not going to have time to read it more than once this semester. So what we're going to try to do now is get you used to reading difficult material and show you some places that you could anchor yourself in the essay. The other thing is, I don't know whether I have the authority to tell. I don't know whether I have the authority to tell you this, but I will certainly speak. Okay, I will certainly speak from my own experience. Sometimes I just don't try to teach the whole essay to the students. When I assign it, I give them places they can go, and then when they get to the classroom, I see where they are. And if they're really lost, I'll say, okay, well, this time let's just go and look at these passages, the passages that I've marked. And we can read them out together, and we can generate group readings of them. And they will have something that they understand and that they can remember. And they will also have a place in the essay that they can go back and say, yes, I got this idea there. Because ultimately, unless they're going to be philosophers, they don't need to understand everything about the particular and the general. Okay, so that's a great question. And for me, it's a little bit easier to think of visual art, although Adorno himself was really interested in music. And for instance, he was really interested in Wagner. But I'm just going to name a couple of things that come to mind. So you could look at, for instance, the Egyptian pyramid. Most people can see how that is art that is created to deify the rulers, even though it came at great cost and suffering of the slaves that built it. It conformed to a style that we'll always associate with ancient Egypt, but it contains within its being as an artistic monument some record of the suffering that created it. So again, just sort of speaking randomly, you could show them a slide of Michelangelo's Adam touching God's finger on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. One of the things that they talk about is the style always belongs to the rulers. So the rulers in ancient Egypt create the style to which the pyramid conforms. The Catholic Church creates the style that becomes the horizon for creation for the Renaissance artists. But an artist like Michelangelo, his art is great. It transcends style. It transcends its own time because it's able to imbue its images with something that it seems lastingly human. And for Adorno and Horkheimer, that lastingly human element is kind of the poignant suffering element. So for them, great art is something that transcends style. It absorbs the style of the times, but it transcends it. So then the soccer stadium would be something that would again be like mass culture. It's sort of a trophy that signals kind of the vastness, the wealth, the greatness of our current society. But it's made to order. It's made to look like every other soccer field. And the kind of touch of human suffering that goes into it is lost. And all you have is this record of kind of prosperity, of athletic might, of all those tickets that are going to be sold. I don't know if I am satisfying you or not. I'm really making this up. But this, my own command of Adorno and Horkheimer is as good as I can do, but it's not perfect. So, Shonda, I'm kind of stuck there because I don't actually have a command of a lot of the mass cultural texts that the students like. But the thing I was trying to think of before is Hunger Games, the what the young woman in Frontline was talking about. But actually, most of my students, whenever I start talking about Adorno, beg me to watch The Matrix, and that is a film. That's a film in which sort of the ability to opt out, to opt into a world in which you see an uncharmed reality, is still there, but it's precarious. And most people just eat the pill that allows them to go through this world of sort of manufactured satisfaction. So that's coming close to the bottom of my barrel. I'm not sure I have others.